This is the story of a miniature horse called Walter and the confession of his trainer, who broke away from the traditional approach to horse training in order to try some of the most extreme progressive ideas out there. It really does feel like a confession, because even now I know there will be judgment, and I will always wonder if I could have done it better. Spoiler alert, I know I could have, but it's a pretty amazing story nonetheless. The results are probably not what you would expect, or at least they weren't what I expected when I began this journey almost 3 years ago. Where I come from, the progressive methods I used with Walter were mocked and derogatively called being green, along with things like recycling and trying to be more environmentally friendly, which kind of tells you a bit about the caliber of people I was surrounded with, but that's another matter. People looking in were horrified and assured me they could break and tame this tiny horse in a day. To be honest, I second-guessed myself all the time, afraid that maybe I really was wrong and making a fool of myself. I had made the decision that I would break away from the dominance-based training methods and went completely against the old ideas of learned helplessness, respect, and submission. Instead, I focused on his nervous system, trying to keep him calm and engaged. In order to do this, I was sensitive to my own body language, my manner of movement, the noises I made, the way in which I engaged with other horses in front of him. Consent was my biggest priority. I never confronted him, never pulled or pushed or smacked him. My aim was to communicate to him, "You are safe, and I will not harm you." Walter is a young miniature horse stallion who first came into my care on the 19th of August 2020. He was a colt at the time, and at the age of 10 months had basically no handling whatsoever. He had just been herded out of the Drakensberg Mountains, where he had lived up to that point with his mother and herd mates. He was captured, shaved, put on auction in the snow, and then shipped to his new home in Pretoria. The moment I saw him, I knew he was in a category of his own behaviorally. He was the very definition of wild, and honestly, who could blame him? With him, you weren't starting with a blank slate. You were starting from a place of trauma, which is much harder. I remember looking at him and thinking, if we're lucky, we'll get him to be semi-halter tame. I doubt we'll get much more out of him. It was touch and go getting him onto the property safely. We managed to get him into the lunging ring and decided to remove his travel blanket and take the lead off his halter. We were hoping to see him move around a bit and see what he was really like. After all, he had been bought unseen. Walter did not disappoint. He scanned his environment, trotted up to the side of the arena, and promptly jumped out. He was a colt not taller than 80 centimeters, and the arena fence was well over a meter. So, turns out we have a jumper. He had no idea where he was, but he made the best of it and dodged into the nearest open paddock, where he was promptly introduced to the rest of the miniature herd living on the plot. It was unplanned, a bit messy, and came to typify the first few days of Walter's life with me. It was obvious from the get-go that Walter's fight or flight reflex was immense. He was terrified of everything he came into contact with, most especially humans. Water troughs, food buckets, dogs, chickens, gates, fences, poles, cars, horse boxes, bales of grass, bags. There was nothing that would not throw him into a complete panic. He hated having to walk on foreign surfaces, like brick paving or cement. For the first few days, he was in a smaller paddock with 2 other colts, so that he didn't feel overwhelmed when integrated into the main herd. There was a small stable in that paddock, and it came in handy at the end of the day when it was time to get Walter into his stable. Using a bucket of lucerne, I would innocently wander into the paddock and start giving the other 2 colts little bits of lucerne, like it was Christmas. This caught Walter's attention. As it turns out, he's very serious about good food. I would innocently drop little bits on the ground and leave a trail into the stable, which I would leave wide open with the rest of the bucket on the floor. I would then retreat about 20 meters away and let him walk into the stable at his own pace, following the food. This was only half the process though, because he still had to get from that stable to his own stable, which was a few meters outside of the paddock. Walking him there was like a teenager learning how to drive. He would freeze, bolt, stop, turn, reverse, freeze, bolt some more, until we finally got to his stable. After a few days, he figured out which stable was his and would get there on his own steam for quite a long time after that. Getting a halter onto Walter's face was a difficult job for the first while, and I felt very defeated every time I had to force it on him. The first day I put the halter on him while he reared at the walls trying to get away. It was horrible. To work this out, I made some changes. I always put Walter's halter on last, when he had seen his stablemate have his halter put on. I would let him watch, then go to him and present the halter to him. This would invariably cause a panic, and he would stand in the corner of his stable and shiver. I would wait until he stopped shivering and stood calmly. I would approach him slowly, talking softly, and if he went into another panic, I would back off and wait for him to calm down. Each time he became reactive, I would angle my body away from him and take a step away from him. This could be a very timely process, taking a number of minutes. But in a fairly short period of time, just over a week or so, he began to stand in the corner without panicking when I presented the halter. It was a small victory, but I celebrated it for the accomplishment it was. Then, after some more time, he would retreat to his corner, but he would face me and have the halter put on. Another victory and another step forward for him. And one morning, he simply came and put his nose in the halter and waited for me to buckle him up and take him outside. It was just no longer an issue. Leading him on the halter followed a similar process as the morning haltering routine. Initially, he was terrified of everything, including not only me, but also the open stable door, the dogs outside, the wheelbarrows or food buckets or other horses or saddles. The list was infinite. I tried as far as possible to never pull on the lead, and if he froze, I would simply wait for him to walk on again. I counted my steps, trying to keep them smooth and even. If he bolted, I would slacken the lead and give him the time he needed to calm down again. A horse in flight mode will learn nothing, so you might as well wait for his brain to come back online. At one stage, he refused to walk through a narrow paddock gate, so I asked a groom to walk behind him at a non-threatening distance with a herd mate of his, to encourage him to navigate the gate without me having to pull on the lead. It worked like magic, and soon that was no longer an issue. Catching Walter would be an issue for some time, although I had underestimated his intelligence and willingness to cooperate with humans. Initially, once he knew where his stable was, he would follow the rest of the horses into their stables at a safe distance, often dodging behind bushes, cars, or bigger horses anytime you looked like you were thinking of catching him. If he got distracted by something, I could walk a wide circle around him and generally herd him towards his stable, never coming close enough to cause him to panic, just enough to make him move along. By the second week of living with me, he was moseying his way to his stable when I heard someone whisper, "Can you believe she hasn't trained him to be caught yet? It's unbelievable." I had been thrilled with the progress he was making in his morning routine, facing me for the halter and walking on a loose lead. Now I stood back and thought, am I wrong? Should I be taking a more aggressive approach to working with this horse? My gut instinct told me that I was on the right path with him, but my insecurities wanted to swallow me whole. It was so difficult to hold the course and celebrate his victories by myself. I heard the whispers of how better horsemen could tame this little horse in a day, and I just didn't know what I was doing. But after 4 weeks of patiently waiting, using the science of horsemanship and neuroscience of horses, emphasizing consent, being calm and steady, the effort began to pay off. I came to the paddock one day to find Walter waiting for me at the gate, ahead of all his friends. Unquestioningly, he popped his nose into his halter and allowed me to walk him to his stable with no fear or panic. He chose to be caught. His trust in me was slowly becoming a reality. From then on, this would be his routine. He would willingly come to the gate, put his nose into his halter, completely unafraid and confident. From there it began to snowball. I would sit in his stable or in the paddock, and he would sniff my hair or clothes while I pretended not to see him. He became comfortable with me touching his nose, his face, his neck, his shoulders, his body, all little bits at a time. He didn't want me to be on his right-hand side, but began to allow me to pick up his feet and gently groom him. At this point, his education began, as he learned how to walk, whoa, back up, and move his hindquarters away. I used pressure and release to teach this, which, looking back, I could have done better and faster with positive reinforcement, but I hadn't yet come that far in my own journey. I put lots of T-touch wraps on him to increase his self-awareness, proprioception, and therefore increase his self-confidence. He slowly began to do pole work with and without the wraps, and began to find his feet, both literally and metaphorically. I made use of mimicry for the first time, using other horses to show him what behavior I wanted, before asking him to do it. The results were incredible. With time, he would accept me being on his right-hand side, if it was incidental, then on his own terms, and eventually that also just stopped being an issue. As I made it an absolute rule to only work with him when he was calm and engaged, he became less reactive overall, and spooked less and less as his confidence increased. As he grew up, Walter slowly opened up to other people other than myself. He lived in my garden for a number of months and became friends with my partner, who put in the time and effort to be gentle and kind to him. He even began to accept the affection of comparative strangers, and if he could see that I was calm, he allowed himself to be touched and petted. His self-confidence grew, and his trust in me became so strong and unwavering that he grew to be the most reliable horse I have. He transformed from a horse who lived in panic mode to a horse who never spooks at anything. I have learned so much from Walter, and have found myself humbled on a number of occasions by the enormous impact that simple kindness has had on his life. I know the critics are right. They could have broken Walter in a day and produced a compliant servant who was terrified of his own shadow and would never even consider trusting his handler. But for all their speed, they would never have produced this: a stallion who loves his owner and is confident in himself and the world around him. To bring this part of Walter to life took time, putting aside ego and being sensitive to the experience of the horse first and foremost. Looking at it now, I could possibly have done it better if I had used positive reinforcement, and my work with him now doesn't make nearly as much use of pressure and release as it did initially. I have found positive reinforcement to be an incredibly powerful tool and use it with all my horses now, which I didn't even consider at the time Walter first came to me. All of that aside, I have learned some valuable lessons from training Walter. I have learned to work without expectations and revel in the victories your horse gives you as he develops. I learned that unwanted behavior isn't disrespectful, naughty, domineering, or whatever else you might label it. It's your horse being a horse and responding to his nervous system and instincts. I learned that going against the grain is painful, but worth it. When you hear people laughing at you because your horse isn't doing what they think he should be doing, screw them, honestly. Trust the process. Trust your gut. Celebrate your own victories and know that what you have with your horse on a bad day is something they couldn't force out of their horses on their best day.